It's my pleasure to introduce the fifth lecture in the Common Core Distinguished Lecture series. I'm Gwyn Edwards, the director of the Common Core curriculum, and I'll begin the evening by inviting Professor Gina Marchetti, who is the the convener of the Global Issues AOI, to introduce this evening's speaker. Gina.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker this evening, David Held. And you know, I think that it's fabulous that we're finishing off the Common Core lecture series with global issues. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but of all the Common Core areas, only global is paired with issues. Now, what does this mean? What is that issue here? What is an issue? It's, according to the dictionary, an important topic or problem for debate or discussion. But what is at issue with these global issues? Our impacts on local lives, the governance, economic development, and ethics and citizenship that are the sub-areas within the area of inquiry. So in this case, when we look at global here in Hong Kong, in a special administrative region, at the edges of a very powerful nation state, struggling to define what democracy means within this post-colonial context, we realize that these global issues are issues that we all deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now, beyond that, a lot of people say, okay, global issues, I've got that straight, you know, but what about globalization? What does that mean for our livelihoods? What impact does that have on our cultural identities, on our traditions? Or we can think of it another way. Why do we need to take issue with the global? You know, or do we not need to take issue with the global? What do we need to do with this? How do we define these issues? How do we set the agenda? How do we define the parameters of the debate? And you can say, okay, that's all well and good, but what does that have to do within this academic environment? What does that mean for us within the university to set the agenda for the topic and to look at global issues, or any other issue for that matter, to hope for a way of understanding the world from a perspective that the university can provide for us. Now, it's within this context that I'm delighted to have David Held here this evening to help us navigate this global terrain. He comes to us from the University of College, Durham, and I think there are a few other scholars who are as well equipped to talk about or help us think through these global issues. He is the director of Polity Press, at which he co-founded in 1984, and he's the general editor of a very important journal, Global Policy. Since 1989, he has written 5 books with global or globalization in the title and edited several more. Just to name a few: Globalization, Anti-Globalization, Debating Globalization, Global Covenant, The Social Democratic Alternative to the Washington Consensus, Global Transformations, Politics, Economics, and Culture, Democracy and the Global Order, From the Modern State to Cosmopolitan Governance. And, you know, the several collections also have global in the title. Cultural Politics in a Global Age is simply one. But one that really stands out for me is Taming Globalization. Now, certain words come up in all of his writings, and I think these words demand further scrutiny. Debate, democracy, culture, authority, inequality, and transformation. Taming, too, this idea of taming globalization. It might be the title that's closest to our own interests here in Hong Kong. Now, before I turn things over to Professor Held, I also want to draw your attention to 2 of his books that I haven't mentioned that really bookend his career as a scholar from my point of view. In 1989, he wrote a book that I found very important in my own development as a scholar. It was called Introduction to Critical Theory, Horkheimer to Habermas. Now, looking closely at the work of a group of academics from the Frankfurt School in Germany, which began during the Weimar period, even before Hitler. And in this book, looking at this historical precedent, if you will, for a group of thinkers coming together to develop a theory, a way of understanding society, bringing together an interdisciplinary mix that would look at this field of culture, society, economics, and politics in a completely novel and new way. I think this is a foundation for his thinking. More recently, I think another book also bookends his career, called Cosmopolitanism, Ideals and Realities. This extends that idea that Habermas had of the public sphere, of a debate beyond national borders, of thinking of ourselves as cosmopolitan citizens of a world, but different than the way Enlightenment thinkers thought of this in an elite way centuries ago. Now, I ask you all to think about this as Professor Held speaks to us. What tools do we need to understand our place in this more cosmopolitan, globalized environment? Can we learn anything from the experiences of academics associated with places like Frankfurt and the Frankfurt School and their wanderings around the world? Many of them were in exile during Hitler's period in Germany during the Third Reich, in America and other places. What are these experiences, and how can this idea of exile and a cosmopolitanism reinforced by exile give us a different way of thinking about our own situation here in Hong Kong? Now, tonight, his lecture will be on Gridlock, Why Global Cooperation is Failing When We Need It Most. This book is currently in press. It will come out soon. I think that he is the one academic that I have the most confidence in showing us the way out of this gridlock and the way forward in Hong Kong as well as elsewhere. So I'd like to give him a warm welcome tonight.
Good evening, and welcome to you all, and thank you very much for inviting me to Hong Kong and to this lecture theatre. Thank you all of you who've made this possible. I'm very glad to be here. I've been in Hong Kong 24 hours. I'm not going to think about what time it is in the UK, because I'll either want to have breakfast or go to bed, one or the other. This lecture today is the first time I've given a lecture on the themes of my latest book, as I already announced, as Gridlock, Why Global Cooperation is Failing When We Need It Most. I came to this theme and this title after I went to many, many lectures on why the environmental negotiations, the climate change negotiations at Copenhagen failed. Climate change, as you all know, is a pressing issue. It's a pressing global issue. And at Copenhagen a few years ago, there was a massive attempt to bring together all the major nation states to try and come up with a global deal. It did not succeed. And after a while, I began to think that this question was the wrong question. It really wasn't, why did the international negotiations at Copenhagen fail? That wasn't the right question. You could have asked the same question about why the trade negotiations from Doha onwards failed, and why international negotiations across a huge range of sectors are themselves breaking down at this time. So the question, it seemed to me, that we really want to ask is, why are international negotiations on very important global issues that will affect your lifetime and your children's lifetime, why are they reaching the cul-de-sac? Why are they in a state of deadlock? So this set of arguments come out of that reflection, and I wrote this book with two of my former students, two younger men than me, Tom Hale and Kevin Young, and so the arguments come from this joint enterprise. Now, I'm quite good at summarizing arguments, so I'm going to summarize the argument now, and I will summarize it halfway through, and I'll summarize it at the end. So you have to be awake now, again in 20 minutes, and again in 40 minutes. So if you just set your watches to that, you will know the main arguments. So the 4 points I really want to make are this. Oh, by the way, I'm going to put this lecture on the course website. So if you don't take all the notes you want, do not worry. You will have the full document available to you. If not this week, then next week. Okay, the 4 points I want to make are this. There is a demand for solutions to global challenges and pressing global problems, such as climate change. And this demand to resolve issues like global climate change is not being satisfied, is not being met. Global cooperation, is my first point, has been faltering, has been failing across a lot of areas. So global cooperation is failing across a lot of areas. The first point I want to make. The second point is that recent failures of global cooperation are not the result of a single underlying cause, as I'll say in a minute. They can be explained by a number of underlying causes coming together, and I call this situation gridlock. That's the second point I want to make. The third point I want to make is global cooperation is failing not simply because global policy is hard to make, and it's very hard to solve climate change. Let's not make any mistake. Even with all the will in the world, and all nation states agreeing on what has to happen, the shift from a high-carbon economy to a low-carbon economy is a hugely difficult shift to engineer in technological terms, as well as changes to the lifestyles of everyday life. So these are very difficult issues. But it's not just because, and this is the third point, global cooperation is failing because problems are difficult. It's failing because of the success of previous phases of global cooperation, previous phases of successful globalization. So number one, we have a lot of cooperation problems that are not being resolved. Number two, there are many reasons for this. Number three, one of the primary reasons is the success of previous eras. Not their failure, their success. And the fourth point I want to make today is getting out of gridlock is really difficult. And I don't see easily where the global leadership is going to come from to resolve some of these problems. Why? Washington is increasingly itself gridlocked between Democrats and Republicans on pressing issues. Europe is increasingly inward-looking and preoccupied with the fate of the euro and austerity. China's political legitimacy, the legitimacy of Chinese government, depends increasingly on successful economic performance, so is inherently, in a way, inward-looking. So, where are the great leaderships going to come from to address these issues? Something we'll come back to in the end. I want to begin by outlining the remarkable successes of the Second World War era in facilitating globalization, the changing structures of the world economy, in helping to engineer the huge decades of prosperity that followed 1945. And they created a shift from relatively isolated countries operating and producing things in relative isolations to what I call the world of increasing overlapping communities of fate, where the fate and fortunes of countries are increasingly tied together. Go to any shop on any corner and you will find items in there that come from global supply chains. Buy any more complex product and you're likely to find in it components that come from global supply chains. On Valentine's Day, at least in the UK, it's good to buy roses for one's beloved. Where do they come from? They've been flown in overnight, in the case of the UK, from West Africa. Global supply chains, global interconnectedness. The great success of the Chinese economy over the last 25 years, I'll come back to that later, highly interdependent with the large, high consumption and indebtedness of the United States. I once was asked by a Chinese economist to explain, or to try and explain, why it was that the United States has reached such a state of public indebtedness. And I explained one of the reasons is they overfunded Chinese demand for a very long time. So there's something fundamentally interconnected between the US and Chinese economies. That's why I don't believe in the foreseeable future, at any rate, there's any prospect of China going to war with the United States or vice versa, because their economies are utterly intertwined. So we live in this interconnected world. How do we get there? It is what I call a virtuous circle of self-reinforcing interdependence. Now, how do we get there? I can see I'm only going to cover a fraction of my lecture, and I explain it all carefully. So we'll have to see how far we go. What time do you want me to stop? Let's be clear about that. Anyone want to tell me? 7:15 or before? Okay. So let me start with the Second World War, which is all familiar to you. The Second World War was extraordinarily destructive. It left Europe in devastation and other parts of the world, like Japan, in with equally damaged infrastructures. But the Second World War and the disaster of the Second World War in human terms and in infrastructural terms also created the unique opportunity after 1945 to think about how you would reorder the world order after that kind of war. Because the early part of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, of course, saw two devastating wars, World War I and World War II. And there was almost no place in the world which wasn't affected by these great wars, particularly the Second World War. And of course, the Great Depression had come in between. So Europe at the end, and the world at the end of 1945, was the end of a number of things. The end of the British Empire, the end of the dominance of Europe. But it was also a set of countries more or less in ruins. And presidents of the United States and prime ministers saw in this an opportunity, once and for all, to face the risks of war and to attempt to create institutions that themselves would allow for stable and peaceful prosperity. It was a big ambition. And the President of the United States at that time spoke deliberately about moving from the Second World War to a peaceful world order governed by institutions which every country in the world would have a stake in. These institutions needed to be better than the previous ones. After all, they had led to the First and Second World Wars, broadly speaking. But more than that, they had to incentivize the great powers, some of the most aggressive powers in history, to participate in them. So the United Nations was born, and the United Nations did two things at the same time. It created a universal membership for all countries of the world at that time, but it also gave special privileges to the victors of the Second World War, particularly in this case, at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union as it was, to participate by giving them veto power in the Security Council. So the new organization, the UN system, enshrined the privileges of the dominant states as they were in international law, and it bound them also to common rules of decision-making. Now, today when we look back at the UN system, it is easy to criticize the UN for the many ways it and the nations that created it have fallen far short of a world order of peace and simple prosperity. There have been more wars almost since 1945 than there were in the 2 centuries that came before. Yet, it would be a great mistake to underestimate the successes brought by the UN system and the stability, the geopolitical stability that followed its foundation. The decades that followed the Second World War were marked by this, crucially, peace between the great powers, even though they fought it out in an enormous number of proxy wars in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. Although by no means the sole cause, the UN is central to this story. Of course, nuclear deterrence and MAD, as it was known, mutually assured destruction, the risk that if one party used a nuclear weapon, the other party would too, with the result that both would be devastated, is also a critical factor in explaining why the great powers did not confront themselves directly again on the battlefield. But the UN is certainly part of this story. These institutions, I think, with the UN at its center, constituted a post-war security order that effectively put an end to the great scourge of conflict, that is, conflict between the great powers themselves. This shift, along with a number of emerging very important norms of international law, like human rights, created the conditions for a number of other things: decolonization, a process overseen by the UN, and successive waves of democratization, which could begin to take root once empire had come to an end. The post-war order, however, was not simply focused on security issues, keeping the great powers separate and in institutions rather than out of them. It was also, of course, hugely important as an economic project. And a year before the UN, 2 or 3 very important institutions were created at the same time. And these are known as the Bretton Woods organizations, and they were established to foster economic cooperation and a prosperous global economy. There was on the one side the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, on the other side the World Bank. The IMF focused on exchange rate stability and balance of payments assistance to countries in trouble. and the World Bank focused on long-term economic development. And a sister institution called the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which developed later as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, insisted on open borders for international trade. So exchange rate stability, long-term economic development, and openness of borders became part of the economic priorities of the post-war period. And while the economic record of the post-war years clearly varies by country to country, many began in the 50s and 60s to experience significant economic growth, and living standards rose rapidly across many parts of the world. By the time we get to the 1980s, the story is even more remarkable, because you get a variety, of course, of East Asian countries beginning to grow at unprecedented rates. And later, of course, in the 1990s, here, China, India, Brazil gained enormous economic momentum. The world economy was not only structured for dominant economic interest, it welcomed new players, and new players could enter because they had cost advantages. The more open the economy, the more cost advantage helps. Low wages initially in China and elsewhere allowed products to be produced in China for export across the world. Whereas in the 19th century, Britain had been the manufacturing center of the world. By the end of the 20th century, it of course was China. And wherever you look in the UK, whatever you buy, if it's white goods, it says made in Germany. If it's a car, it's likely to say made in Germany or France. But anything else is likely to say made in China. What a shift in power. Remarkable levels of economic growth. And the importance of these levels of economic growth are not economic growth per se, but they lift millions, hundreds of millions of people out of absolute poverty. Estimated to now in China, that China in the last 25 years has lifted between 450 to 500 million people out of absolute poverty. We have never seen anything like it in history. Meanwhile, as economic growth was accelerating, so too was something else, the creation of institutions, global institutions, to underpin it. Whereas once participation in the multilateral order was sporadic and tenuous, in the mid-19th century, a British Prime Minister might be called to 1 or 2, perhaps even 3 international conferences per annum. By the end of the 20th century, a Prime Minister or President could potentially attend dozens, if not hundreds. In 1909, there were 37 international governmental organizations. In 2011, there were 7,608. There's been a substantial growth as well in international treaties, as well as all sorts of legal arrangements between states and among states. To this dense web of mechanisms of coordination and collaboration are all the key meetings of the international fora. You name it, the UN, Bretton Woods, and the G Group. Once upon a time, there was the G1, the United States, then the G2, the United States and the Soviet Union, then the G5, and the G7, and G8, and the G20 now is a recognition that the world has changed. You can't solve problems by the G5 and G7. You have to have larger groupings of countries in order to begin to face global issues, such as stabilizing the world economy. In 2007-8, the world economy was absolutely at the edge of the precipice. When Lehman Brothers went down and went bankrupt, that sent shockwaves through the world economy. But through the G20 and other institutions I'll come on to later, there was coordination between economic policies of many of the most powerful economies across the world and between the central banks across the world, and it's that coordination that injected liquidity into the world economy, that lowered interest rates, the reverse of the Great Depression, and that's provided enough stability for the world economy not to drop over the edge as it did in 1929. It's institutions that make that difference. These new kinds of institutional arrangements have emerged, alongside the big multilaterals. By the big multilaterals, I mean, of course, the UN system, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. You know about these organizations. But there are many, many others as well. Networks of domestic government officials now linked with their peers across the world, e.g. central banks. Central banks might seem, the Central Bank of China, the Central Bank of the UK, the Bank of England, may seem like relatively isolated institutions, but they are talking to each other all the time. The landscape of cooperation has changed. Cooperation to achieve global policy solutions also involves a huge range of new actors, not just public, but also private, to tackle issues of common concern. When many of the world's largest corporations today dwarf the size of many countries, you can't solve global collective action problems, global challenges, without bringing on board the private sector as well. In some ways, these new institutions show remarkable flexibility and adaptability, and I'm going to come back to that later. But they also show a number of very profound developing problems. Crucially, the successes of global cooperation, let's turn up to the positive side now. The successes of global cooperation allowed greater and greater economic and political transformations. Indeed, once the world started down this avenue after 1945, you got what I call a self-reinforcing cycle of interdependence, whereby institutionalized nation brought countries together, allowed for economic globalization, which again was institutionalized in various sorts of ways. This created a far deeper form of interconnection between countries than the world had ever known. A world of overlapping communities of fate, where the fate and fortunes of countries become completely enmeshed. So, just to give you a concrete example, the post-war institutions created the conditions under which a variety of economic agents and actors could benefit from forming multinational companies, because those multinational companies knew that their activities in different countries would be secure, law would protect their interests. Allowing investment abroad, developing technologies for global production chains, and a huge range of other processes that we now know of as economic globalization. These conditions, combined with the expansionary logic of capitalism, increased dependence on people and countries from every corner of the world. This in turn created more demand for institutionalization, which allowed greater cooperation. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the post-war institutions, the multilateral order, arguably became as important for world economic development as the microprocessor or email. Do not underrate the significance of institutions of international collaboration. Despite differences between countries, they keep countries talking at the same table, bind them in dialogue, and bind them in institutions. And whilst great wars do not take place, the room for economic and social development continues apace. And that is exactly what we've seen in the last 40 to 50 to 60 years, and particularly in the last 30 years. This institutional peace, this level of institutional collaboration, has brought economic prosperity that was unthought of. If you ask any liberal economist whether 30 years ago, whether China or India would become economic giants, they would scoff at the idea. And yet 30 years later, of course, these structures have allowed the large developing countries of the world to engage in them in such a way that have given them that stability to transform and develop in a peaceful world economy. It would not have happened without the underpinning of global institutions. So they are, I'm arguing, as important to explaining world economic development in the last period, since 1945, as we now think of as computers, IT revolution, and so on. Now, what I want to suggest to you now is this success has brought with it new problems. And these problems are a product of the success. And that the architects of these institutions in the post-war period intended to create the stable, peaceful world order that we've had, but what they did not foresee were a whole series of things that were consequences of that very same success. For example, the explosive growth of carbon emissions across the world is partly a consequence of the success of industrialization across the world. Even if Europe tomorrow and the US tomorrow go carbon neutral and stop contributing anything to carbon growth across the world, the rise of carbon levels in Asia in the next 30 years will keep climate change and the challenge of climate change getting increasingly severe. China now, as you probably know, is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. But that's partly because China is so successful. So their second-order consequences is what I'm trying to suggest. From success come a whole series of challenges unforeseen by the architects of that success. Because of the remarkable success of global cooperation in the post-war order, human interconnectedness weighs more heavily on human politics than ever before. We are bound together as never before. The need for international cooperation has never been higher. And you see how it kicked in 2008 when the world was threatened to go off the precipice into a new global depression. It was that level of cooperation which kept it stable, relatively stable. But the problem is tonight, I want to suggest to you, is that new forms of multilateral cooperation to solve an increasing number of serious problems have stalled, has stopped. In area after area, nuclear proliferation, the explosion of small arms sales across the world, global poverty, biodiversity losses becoming increasingly common, water deficits in many countries, climate change, multilateral, in all these areas and many more, what we need is more multilateral and international collaboration. But what are we getting? Increasingly ineffective collaboration. I call this gridlock. Gridlock is not the result of any one issue domain, but it appears to be now an increasingly common feature of our international order. Why? And I want to suggest to you 4 reasons why the mounting global challenges we face are not being adequately met today. And what I want to suggest to you is that the reasons for this are partly a product of the success of the previous era, which is what I've been trying to suggest. There are 4 reasons, I think, why global collaboration is no longer effective, why Copenhagen failed, why the Doha trade round failed, why negotiations to reform the international financial markets got nowhere in the end. In area after area, we see deadlock in international negotiations. Why? There are 4 reasons, I think. Let me just list these now. One is called rising multipolarity. The world is becoming more multipolar. After the Second World War, the US was dominant. In the Cold War, it was a struggle between the US and the USSR. The world was bipolar. But increasingly, for the very reasons that I've spoken about, there are more and more entries into the world economy, more and more entrants into the world economy have become powerful voices in themselves, like China, like India, like Brazil, like South Africa. The world is more multipolar. That's good, and it also has a price. That's one reason. The second reason is institutional inertia. The big old powers that created the post-war era don't want to give it up. And yet we're faced with rising new countries like China, but not only China, many others, who want to be more involved in the international architecture, the international institutions that find the old powers in their way. If you were designing the UN system today, would you give Britain and France veto powers in the Security Council? It doesn't make any sense. If you were starting again, would you design a world in which Britain, by any standards a declining country, would have veto power in the Security Council? Of course not. This only makes sense in light of 1945 and the settlement that immediately followed. So institutional inertia, you have rising polarity, institutional inertia, and problems are just harder to solve, like climate change. And I'll come on to others in a minute. And there's a fragmentation of institutions. So 4 reasons, I'm going to explain them all now. Emerging multipolarity, institutional inertia, more complex problems to deal with, and institutional fragmentation. Each of these pathways explains, in some senses, why international institutions are increasingly coming unstuck, as I will explain. But together, they are a pretty formidable obstacle to human progress. And what are they? They are all a product of success, not failure. They are second-order consequences of success. So let me go through these all. What do I mean by the first one? Growing multipolarity. This is crucial to the world you all live in now. The absolute number of states has increased by 300% in the last 70 years, meaning that at the most basic level, the transaction costs of coming together and negotiation have gone up. You know it yourself. If you want to go out for a drink with your friends or go somewhere afterwards, if there's 2 of you, it's easy to make a quick decision. If there's 4 of you, there's more discussion. If there's 10 of you, there could be fragmented groups. Let's go here, let's go there. The more there are, the harder it is to get an agreement of where you're going to go and party that night. Unless there's one place, of course, that's so attractive that you all want to go there anyway. More importantly, the number of states matters on any given issue. This is the question. More importantly, the number of states that actually are important, the number of states that actually matter on any given issue has expanded. And that makes coming to an agreement harder. Let me give you an example. At Bretton Woods, that founded the IMF and the World Bank in 1945, the rules of the world economy could essentially be written, and here's the point, by the United States with some collaboration from the UK and other European allies. So in 1945, the world structure was created by the US and 1 or 2 of its allies. In the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the G20 has become the principal forum for global economic management. What a shift. The US and Europe could have all its way for so long. The last 300 years have been the centuries of the West. The West has written the rules. Even after 1945, the West could write the rules. Not anymore. The G20 has become the principal forum for global economic management, not because established powers like the US desired to be more inclusive or more friendly to anyone else, but because they can't solve the problems on their own. There is, of course, much to celebrate, of course, in the rise of multipolarity. It brings hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, transforms countries. But at the same time, it brings with it a cost. That is, the more parties you have at the negotiating table with pressing interests, the higher the risk that they will not be able to come to an agreement. And in many, many international negotiations, we see that. At Copenhagen itself, the differences between the Chinese, Indian, developing country, Europe, and the US positions became insurmountable. More voices, more negotiating positions than could easily be resolved. So the consequence is that the more countries you have representing a divergent range of interests, the harder it is for them to agree on a way forward. The second point I want to make, the second cause of gridlock, is what I've referred to earlier, institutional inertia. The post-war order succeeded in being stable partly because it incentivized the great powers to stay in the game and not just walk out and pursue their own interests. From the Security Council to the Bretton Woods institutions to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the key pillars of the global order explicitly granted special privileges to the countries that were wealthy and powerful at the time. Here's the deal. You help write the system and stabilize it, but we will protect your interests. This hierarchy was necessary, some argue, precisely to ensure that the US and Europe stayed in the international institutions in the post-war period, precisely for the reasons that have led to the 70 years of stable global economic growth. They didn't fight each other, they fought on the margins in lots of countries, but not each other. Today, this gain, this trade-off between, on the one hand, including all our countries in international institutions, on the other hand, actually giving power to a few, the club of the few, this trade-off has shrunk while the benefits have shrunk while the costs have grown. As power has shifted, as the center of economic gravity, as the LSE economist Danny Quah puts it, has shifted from west to east, from north to south. You can actually measure the center of world economic gravity. In the 19th century and most of the 20th century, up until the 1960s and 70s, the center of world economic activity was between Europe and the United States, somewhere mid-Atlantic. Now, if you measure and weight global economic activity, that point of center is shifting eastwards very fast. And if all goes as it is, which is a big if, by 2050 the center of economic gravity will be between India and China. So as power has shifted, a broader range of participation is needed on nearly all global issues if they are to be adequately dealt with. At the same time, following decolonization, the end of the Cold War, and economic development, The idea that some countries should hold more rights and privileges than others is increasingly and rightly regarded as morally bankrupt. And yet the architects of the post-war institutions, the very successful post-war institutions, did not, in most cases, design them so they would adjust according to changes in the distribution of power. Instead, the power of the original set of leading states is still firmly embedded in these institutions themselves, making it more difficult to change them. That's the second reason. More voices, inert institutions. The third reason is the problems are so much harder, these problems of success, to solve than they were before. As interdependence between countries has deepened, the types and scopes of problems around which countries must cooperate has changed. Problems are now more extensive, implicating a broader range of countries than ever before and individuals within those countries, and more intensive, being more penetrative of everyday life. Consider just one example: trade. For much of the post-war era, trade negotiations between countries focused on reducing tariff levels on manufactured products traded between industrial countries. That was the big trading issue for most of the post-war period. How you created an open world economy by reducing tariffs on manufactured products so that one country couldn't get the benefit of engaging in the world by overtaxing incoming trade. The idea was you lower tariff barriers between all countries so trade can flow, and demand and supply, as the economists say, can equalize over time according to the best advantages of each and every country. Now, however, negotiations at world trading events are much more complicated. Negotiating a trade agreement today requires also discussing a host of, this is new, social, environmental, and cultural subjects, intellectual property rights, health and environmental standards, biodiversity, labor standards, genetically modified foods. All these issues are issues about which countries disagree. They go to the heart of lifestyle choices of these countries. In the area of environmental change, a similar set of considerations apply. Listen to this. Quite smoggy out there today. To clean up industrial smog or address ozone depletion requires a fairly limited number of actions by a limited number of top polluters. So the great smogs you might have read about in London in the 1950s and early 60s, I'm old enough to have gone to school at a time when you could not see your hand. At the worst of these smogs, you could not see your hand in front of your face. But to resolve that just required decisive action by the UK and by European countries to phase out a certain kind of coal that created smoke and a shift to what's called smokeless fuels. That made a huge difference in cleaning up air and in cleaning up immediate industrial pollution. Now, of course, today it's more complicated because of cars and so on and so forth. But that needed only the agreement of a small number of polluters to move forward. By contrast, the threat of climate change and the efforts to mitigate it involve nearly every country of the world. Hugely more complicated. Yet the divergence of voice and interest between the developed and developing worlds, along with the sheer complexity of the incentives needed to create a low-carbon economy, have made a global deal thus far impossible. The issues are more difficult. Trade was about tariffs, now it's about lifestyles. Pollution was about smog, now it's about carbon emissions. How do you do that in a world where there's no easy economic reason for shifting to low-carbon sources of energy? Take China. China has come out of nowhere 10 years ago to be the world's biggest producer of wind turbines, solar panels, and various other forms of alternative energy. An astonishing achievement. Yet, 60%, as I understand it, of Chinese energy still comes from coal. We do not yet have a technology to capture the carbon emissions. The technology is called carbon capture and storage. It's a hugely important technology that allows you to use coal-fired power stations but captures the carbon and pumps it underground. Whilst we know basically how to do that, we don't have a commercial system to put it in place. And the risks of carbon capture and storage, pumping all this carbon into the earth, carries with it also very considerable risks. So even though we know what the problem is, multipolarity, harder to agree how to deal with it. Institutional inertia, the old powers defend their interests, and the problems, unforeseen by the founders of this institutional order in 1945, are so much harder now to find common agreement on. And they are harder because there's more voices, more interests, more resistance, and they're just harder. I mean, how do you move to a low-carbon economy? It's an extremely demanding question. And the fourth reason for gridlock is the fragmentation of institutions themselves. The institution builders of the 1940s began with essentially a blank slate. But efforts to cooperate internationally today have as their backdrop a huge number of different kinds of institutions, the formal multilaterals, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, and any number of smaller global institutions and organizations. The rise in these organizational institutions has been momentous. At the same time, this carries a risk of fragmentation. Which institution, which country, which institution is responsible for what? I'll give you an example, AIDS, HIV in Africa. I've done some work on this. In AIDS, HIV in Africa, whilst the international organizations have been quite effective in halting the rapid growth of AIDS, HIV infections, on the ground at any one time, you had donor nations, a plethora of NGOs, you had the Americans coming on the ground under the Bush, putting vast amount of very significant resources into it, but also coming with a moral view that abstinence was the crucial solution. Sexual abstinence was a crucial solution to preventing the development of AIDS, HIV. That was not going to be a winning argument in many, many national contexts. So you had a large number of institutions on the ground, some countries, some international institutions, some NGOs, often with very, very different principles and policies, all trying to pursue it at the same time. In this context, then, the proliferation of institutions tends to lead to dysfunctional fragmentation, reducing the ability of international institutions to be effective. So, let me sum up where I am again. This is two-thirds of the way through. I've stressed that there are 4 different pathways to institutional gridlock. And any one of these is enough to create gridlock, but together they are quite a pernicious dynamic. Growing multipolarity, positive on the one side, but leads to a diversity of voices and interests that are hard to resolve on the other. Institutional inertia, the institutions of the post-war era put the Western countries in a dominant position, but it didn't help set up how one changes that should power shift in any fundamental way across the world. Issues are becoming much more harder to resolve because they are second-order consequences of success. And institutions are also often fragmented in their efforts. It's not clear what problem comes under which institution. So let me summarize what I said to you. 6 points now. 1, the pathways or mechanisms of gridlock today are the products of the success of the post-war era. That is to say, they're at least in part the products of the hugely significant institutional changes and the changes to everyday life that the post-war order created. Gridlock pathways create, however, very different challenges than the 1945 era. In 1945 era, the issue was keep the global peace and create the conditions for countries essentially to trade with each other. The incentives to trade were to lower tariffs, as I've said. Today, it's much more complicated. These individual pathways to gridlock build upon one another. The next point I want to make is sometimes, in one area, more of these institutional pathways to gridlock are important than in others. And now I want to illustrate this to you, if I have time, by giving 3 examples. One from security, one from trade, and climate. These will go whistle past you, so I'll do it really quickly, because you've had all the theory, you've had all the arguments, now I'm going to illustrate it, okay? So let me just shoot through what hopefully will be examples of what I've been talking about. Let's start with security. At the core of the post-war multilateral order sits the UN Security Council and various disarmament treaties. These are 2 domains where problems of institutional inertia in particular and emerging multipolarity are especially pronounced. Both fundamentally reflect the post-war balance of power, which is a source of their strength now and a weakness. It's the interplay between institutional inertia and emerging multipolarity that creates so many problems. Let me tell you why. The historical use of the Security Council veto illustrates how the P5, that's the permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, have operated to protect and further their interests over time. For example, the US has consistently exercised its veto on questions pertaining to Israel, and more recently, Russia and China have invoked theirs against security resolutions on Syria, violent attacks on its civilians, the Sudanese government's brutality in Darfur, and in other similar cases. Why? Because foreign policy interests were at stake. Attempts at reforming the Security Council. There have been so many attempts to reform the Security Council. Commission after commission, report after report, they give reports a very bad name, have all gathered dusts on shelves. The dominant interests, in other words, have continued to stop and trump the reform process, so that despite the fact that they're now emerging powerful countries of the world, not just the P5 will not let their grip of the Security Council go. Similar problems of institutional inertia and increasing multipolarity are found in the disarmament regimes and in efforts to deal with the most deadly weapons ever created, nuclear weapons. I'm going to say this just very quickly. There's two kinds of nuclear proliferation. Horizontal, whereby more and more countries get nuclear weapons, and vertical, which is the relationship between the dominant powers that have nuclear weapons and everybody else. Essentially, the post-war nuclear proliferation regime has been quite successful at stopping horizontal proliferation. For example, South Africa, South America, and East Asia are largely free of nuclear weapons. That is not a trivial success story. On the other hand, the dominant powers, the United States and Russia, still, despite all negotiations between them, have enough nuclear weapons to send us all, to bring the world to the end many, many times over. The vested interests of these countries and the structural protections they enjoy in the UN system and the NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, have allowed them to sustain their arsenals of global destruction and to keep them. While the staggered and incremental successes of negotiations between these countries are important, they've obviously fallen far short of any attempt to eliminate the world of nuclear weapons. And alongside the inertia that we have along many of these traditional weapon systems in the global arena, there are many other new kinds of issues which there's no currently a solution to. Take, for example, terrorism. Terrorism and contemporary forms of terrorism are much more complex than they used to be. Think of the IRA in Northern Ireland, creating a bomb in a car and it goes off. It has an immediate impact on the location, but then you think of 9/11 and it's a scale of destruction of an entirely different kind. The new types of global terrorism the world faces have developed alongside globalization. These very groups allow and benefit from the same complexity of interconnectedness and networks that have made the world economy a success. How have we fared in trying to deal with them? While multilateral efforts to deal with terrorism have sometimes been successful, for example, in trying to trace their financial sources and governing the financial sources of terrorism, there is at the heart of the UN a fundamental lack of agreement as to what constitutes terrorism itself. Why? Because emerging multipolarity, different countries interpret terrorism differently. For some, a terrorist act is an act of freedom, is a fight for freedom from domination. For others, it's simply an attack on the security of a country. There are fundamental disagreements at the very heart of the UN system as to what constitutes terrorism itself. This lack of basic agreement shows just how challenging it has been for the multilateral order to form and implement a coordinated response. Now, in the absence of a coordinated response, of course, countries go it alone. I'm going to focus now quickly on the US. If you don't have global collective action agreement, countries' strategies fill the void. In this arena, President Obama has drastically accelerated, for example, the use of drones as a favored tool in US anti-terror strategy. With active drone operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, Obama's instituted a policy that's increasingly calling into question the efficacy of international law and emerging security principles. US drone strikes have recently drawn sharp criticism both from the international community as well as from the national leaders of a variety of countries. Yet despite this criticism, the US shows no sign of changing course. Given it's like a little bit return to outlaw politics. I don't like you, I'll take you out. Cowboy politics. No rule of law. Here we have a country that says that they can track down its enemies or those that threaten it, no matter what the rule of law requires, taking them out and removing them will be the primary objective. This is absolutely at odds with the rule of law, the notion of the rule of law. Given the power of the US system in the international order, Obama's unilateral abrogation of international law undermines the potential for effective rule-based multilateral system. This trend risks deepening the gridlock currently found in the security governance system because it subverts effective trans-border cooperation. So a lack of cooperation built into the UN system incentivizes then great powers to act outside it. Let me just quickly talk about trade. The story of security since 1945 is the story both of multilateral achievements, again, which have prevented a major new global war, but also one of increasing stagnation. The same can be said of global trade. Since 1946, the world has completed 8 successful rounds of trade negotiations. The failure of the 9th round, the so-called Doha Development Round, represents a striking change in direction, as do all the other negotiations I'm talking about. As the logic of gridlock highlights, this failure stems in part because of the success of previous rounds. Let me give you some examples. First, the problems to deal with in trade are harder, as I've already said. I'm not going to elaborate that point at great length now, but just simply to say that economic globalization has increased the pressure to address new kinds of non-tariff barriers, such as I said, intellectual property rights, health and safety standards, and it's no longer simply a question of reducing tariffs or not. It's much harder to agree on that, and different countries in the world have very different views. Second, rising multipolarity has also created a critical role in the Doha failure. In the past, again, global trade negotiation successes often were built on the fact that the US and Europe could force agreement on other countries. For example, when Doha started some years ago, in Doha itself, the US came with 500 trade negotiators and trade lawyers. Europe, the EU, came with 500 trade negotiation and trade lawyers, vastly outnumbering the negotiating teams from anywhere else in the world, with a view, of course, that this combined agreement, this combined might at the negotiating table would lead to an agreement. And based on past negotiating rounds, there was good reason to expect the same would happen again. So in the past, US and Europe have been able, as it were, to set the agenda and to implement their agenda. But this is not any longer happening. Developing countries in general have become much more assertive in their stance towards things like European and American agricultural protectionism and a whole range of other countries. And Brazil and India increasingly have acted as representatives of the rest of the global south and have refused to accept the agenda as laid down by the United States and Europe. It is certainly a good thing that trade negotiations are more balanced than ever before, but it also comes with costs, because a failure of the multilateral trading order brings with it serious risks as well. Let me come to some concluding comments. I've discussed gridlock in the context of 2 areas, giving you just 2 examples, security and trade. But the same dilemma can be found in many other areas as well. And the most evident, to come back to climate change, is that example itself. The diffusion of industrial production across the world, a process that has directly enabled economic globalization, has created a situation in which the basic consumption of each and every individual affects the life chances of each and every individual across the world. This is a powerful and entirely new form of global interdependence. In the past, we've had regional environmental shocks. Think of the Black Death. The Black Death was spread across Europe by trading boats arriving in European ports in the 15th century with rats on board that carried certain bacteria that were unknown. Think of the explosion of Europe onto the world in the 17th and 18th century, the arrival of the of the Europeans in the New World, and they carried with them all sorts of viruses and bacteria, all sorts of things that the indigenous populations of North America and Southern America had no protection from. They were giant regional environmental shocks, as it were, but nothing on the scale of the interdependence of the industrial system and climate change. Put bluntly, the future of our civilization depends on our ability to cooperate across borders on this critical issue. And yet, despite 20 years of multilateral negotiations under the UN, a global deal on climate change remains elusive, with differences between developed countries, which have caused the problem, and developing countries, which will drive future emissions and are driving future emissions, forming the core barrier to progress. Unless we overcome climate negotiations, unless we overcome gridlock in climate negotiations, as in other areas, we'll be unable to continue to enjoy peace and prosperity, I think, that we've inherited from the successful post-war, Cold War order. Now, there are, of course, and this is my last set of remarks, there are, of course, several forces that might work against gridlock. I should be optimistic for a moment. Actually, most of my books are very optimistic. This is my first dark book. So you should read some of my books on cosmopolitanism for optimism that not many people share with me. There are several forces that might serve to undo these second-order consequences, these gridlock mechanisms. These include, for example, the potential of social movements to uproot existing political constraints, catalyzed by the IT innovation and the use of associated technology for the coordination of action across borders. The Arab Spring might come to mind. The capacity of existing institutions to adapt, and they do sometimes adapt, to face a shift from a bipolar world to a multipolar world. We've seen that in the shift from the G1, that's I call the United States, the G5 and 7, to the G20. And, of course, there have been efforts at institutional reform which seek to alter the organizational structure of governance. Proposals to reform the Security Council failed, and to establish a transaction financial tax also failed, but these efforts exist. But here's the question: whether there is political will or leadership to move beyond gridlock remains a pressing question. Social movements find it difficult to convert protest into consolidated institutional change, unless they do so over the long term. For example, early waves of feminism in the late 19th and early 20th century slowly established enough momentum for eventually the suffrage to become a universal suffrage, to include men and women. And second and third generations of feminism have had an incredible effect in raising the expectations of young women across the world, so that women, in less than 30 years, are now outperforming boys, sorry guys, we are dinosaurs, in virtually every major subject at school and university except one or two. But in the short term, converting protest into institutional change is very difficult. At the same time, political leadership of the great powers to deal with these global issues appears dogged by national concerns, as I said at the beginning. Washington sharply divided, Europe preoccupied with the future of the euro, and China absorbed by the challenge of sustaining economic growth as the primary vehicle of domestic success and legitimacy. Against this background, the further deepening of gridlock and the continuing failure to address global collective action problems appears, I'm afraid, more likely than success. So here's my argument again in 3 lines and 3 points. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the institutional breakthroughs that occurred provided fantastic momentum for economic growth, geopolitical stability sufficient to transform the world economy, eventually to create the conditions that led to the end of the Cold War, and to create a new world order of many countries emerging economic success, a shift in the balance of economic power. Striking. This couldn't have happened without the success of the post-war settlement at some level. It was the architecture of 1945 that, despite the fact that the Western interests, the US and Europe, built their interests into it, it created a global market economy, which then eventually other economies with other advantages could come into on a scale no one ever imagined. Huge success story. However, what worked then, and here's my argument, does not work any longer. As new voices bring conflicting interests harder to resolve, and institutional inertia becomes a block to institutional change. As globalization produces new, harder problems, much more difficult to resolve. And as the institutions we have are often fragmented and do not focus effort. What worked then doesn't work now, as Gridlock freezes problem-solving capacity in global governance. And now there's the challenge. My generation has created these problems. Your generation has to solve them. So the search for a politics beyond gridlock in theory and practice remains a hugely difficult task, nationally and globally, and so we look to you to find your way through gridlock. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that stimulating talk. I think we can take some questions.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, you use the word institution a lot. And I was just wondering, does the definition or identity or nature of the term institution, has it changed, over time, over its development, over the change in situations surrounding it? And what sort of issues do we have to bear in mind when we use the term like institution and institutional in this day and age?
Good question. Well, institutions, by institutions, I mean structures of organization which embed authority in some rule-making structures. So we can have institutions of different kinds. Universities are institutions. They have systems of governance structures, departmental structures, which are institutions themselves at some level. The absence of institutions is often the absence of rule-making bodies. After 1945, it was necessary to create international, global institutions to fill a gap that the first half of the 20th century had created. So then these were new, formally created through treaties, rule-making institutions with formal authority and jurisdiction to act in certain areas. But the institutional terrain has become more complex since then, of course, because we don't have only formal institutions like that. We have a whole variety of informal institutions that develop, such that authority is no longer just formally defined, it's often informally defined by a range of groups interacting with each other in much more subtler ways. We have much more informal transnational organizations. And take something like a multinational company. What is that? At one level, you might call it an institutional structure, but it doesn't look like a formal treaty-based organization, and nor is it simply an informal, fluid process. But it is nonetheless a hugely powerful organization that somewhere sits between these two extremes. So we've had a diversity in types of organizations, especially, or not especially, but notably at the international and global level. So what's the question? Remind me again? Is that the question? All right, thank you.
Thank you. David, since you are an expert on international politics, I just wonder what is your view on this? Because you have given us very convincing reason why there's a gridlock now, and in a sense, we need to break through that gridlock. Now, whenever you need to do this with this big change, you need a great leader. And in your presentation, you have given us reasons why the United States, Europe, and China wouldn't be the great leader bringing us out of this gridlock. So I just wonder, what do you think about, power in South America, especially now that we have, the Pope coming from South America? Would they be some of the great leaders taking out of this gridlock? What's your view on this?
Well, in institutional change, to pick it up from where we left off just now, at the global level has often come in the wake after wars. So the shifts in power after 1945, the invention of an architecture of institutions, came really when people stared into the abyss, when political leaders stared into the abyss of what had happened and had to confront their collective failures. The problem is, do we have a capacity to create institutions without war at that level? Climate change threatens to be a problem in consequences even greater than Second World War. Are we able to create institutions to mitigate climate change, knowing it is going to be this catastrophic development in advance of a catastrophe? The history of global shifts in institutions is a history of these shifts after catastrophes. Do we have the foresight to create the institutional and political structures to shift before devastation, before destruction, before we reach a tipping point where it's too late to move in this direction because it's already there? And that is the big challenge. Our history doesn't suggest we're capable of doing that in advance. Why? Because there are too many entrenched interests. Are the Chinese really going to decommission 60% of their energy from coal-fired power stations? Of course not. There isn't sufficient economic incentive to do so. Are the British and American coal-fired power stations and the consumption of oil, the automobile industry in the United States, is that going to shift dramatically overnight? Of course not. There are too many reasons that incentivize the opposite behavior. So when you have a set of incentive structures that lead to a path-dependent, as we call it, form of behavior, you need remarkable leadership across parties, across the political spectrum, to create that shift. As I said, those shifts tend to happen at the global level after catastrophe. We're asking something very important now. Can we make a shift beyond gridlock before these things get out of hand? At the moment, on the global scene, it's very hard to see that happening. Even after the 2008-9 global financial crisis, there was huge talk of fundamentally change to the world regulatory structure, to financial markets, but as soon as the global economy picked up a bit, most of that just disappeared. Or, as one banker put it, not so long after the global financial crisis, what has changed, I won't use their exact language because it was not as sweet as this, they said absolutely nothing. So will South America and countries around the world, other than the ones I've spoken to, have the capacity to lead us in such a direction? I don't see it. So where does that leave us all? It leaves us all exactly where we are. That is to say, you are the agents of change. Social movements are the agents of change. Leadership in countries matters, and the struggle over that leadership matters. And creating global and public institutions that press these issues matter. So there isn't a single answer. Once we thought there was, called it, put your faith in God. In the 19th century, according to the Marxist tradition, put your faith in the working classes, in the proletariat. When the proletariat didn't deliver, it was put your faith in the party to mediate the class interests, and the party would deliver. In the case of democratic countries, it was put your faith in the electoral system, and the electoral system would deliver. But here's the rub. The problem with democracy is often very short-term. The tragedy of democracy, almost the Shakespearean tragedy of its very structure, is democracies are short-term in their focus. The electoral cycle is usually 4 years. Their concern are the citizens of delimited borders. And their ultimate concern is the swing voters in a few constituencies. Are we really going to see these politicians rise above those constraints to provide global leadership? I think it's hard to see it. I think what has been incredibly damaging in the history of the post-war period was, of course, 9/11, but also the reaction to 9/11. I think that was incredibly damaging to international institutions. It, in a way, removed power from those international institutions and put it back towards the great powers. The UN system today, if you go there, if you go to the UN in New York, it seems increasingly like a second-hand car sales room. Power isn't there. The new cars aren't there. They're being shown somewhere else. It was 9/11 and the reaction to 9/11 Because after 9/11, the US had a choice, and its allies had a choice. If they'd seen the terrorist attack on 9/11 as an act of criminal irresponsibility, an act of criminal terrorism that had to be dealt with by applying international law and a policing operation to apprehend those figures, the US would have had the support of nearly every country in the world. But that's not how they came to interpret it. They came to interpret it as a war, like the Cold War, the same language now projected on a new enemy, and they brought to bear the language of warfare to deal with this threat. And the consequence of that, ultimately acting outside the UN system, acting through a coalition of the willing, the consequence of that was to make warfare for the next 10 years against terrorism the dominant global political theme. That bypassed the international institutions in a way I think that seriously weakened them. And now gridlock has been exacerbated by that. It's also been exacerbated by the global financial crisis, which has seen the Western economies, with some exceptions, for example, Germany, increasingly hamstrung by huge debts and public debts. The debt has been passed from the private sector to the public sector. That's something Marx understood very well. When he said the state is but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie, he meant take a banking crisis, who will bear the cost? The costs, the bankers can only win. Profitability is appropriated privately, but the costs of disaster are brought back into the state sector and spread out across the taxpayers. So you have, as a result of both the costs of 9/11, the aftermath of 9/11, and the global financial crisis, the increasing acceleration of, I think, the stagnation of the economic and political might of the West, and the acceleration of East Asia. But you do not have institutions that reflect that.
I think we can take maybe one more question.
Should we take two? Let's take you two. There's two people with microphones. Why don't you go first, and then gentleman here.
Professor Held, thank you for your lecture. As you mentioned, the problem, the gridlock today, is caused by the success in the past half century, and which is people in 30 years ago never predicted. So I want to ask when the burden is going to my generation, and in the future, well, we will make more successes, but these kind of successes will bring along with new challenges and new problems. So what's your meaning by breaking the gridlock? Will the problem be finally solved, or do you have a pattern for breaking the gridlock, or is it will never be solved in the future? Thank you.
My question is on regarding the role of the UN Security Council. As you mentioned, it plays such an important role in the maintaining global order. But I want to ask, what are your views on the Security Council agreement on military action on Libya recently? Was there assertion of like self-political interest of the P5? And what are your views on the outlook of Libya, as well as the role Saif Gaddafi played in the crisis?
Sure. I'll take that one first. It was always my view that NATO intervention in Libya was like to make things worse rather than better. Let's be clear about that. And although the British and the French, with the support of the Americans, heralded the creation of democracy, it was rather like Bush on the battleship 6 weeks after the Iraq War, saying the war in Iraq was over and it was settled. 10 years later, the war in Iraq is anything but settled. The war is settled, but the state of Iraq is in pretty dire shape. And as in the case of Libya, I think that Libya always had, Gaddafi ran a kind of Kafka state, a peculiar mixture of authoritarian and the personalization of the cult of the personality. This is not a good mix for the rule of law, for running a country. It depends, power is centered on one person, and when power is centered on one person, it is often arbitrary with the whims of that individual. If you cut off the head of that individual, as it were, effectively that is what happened, without putting in place an investment in long-term development of institutions, you get a vacuum. And what has happened in Libya now is essentially you have a very weak government that is divided. It has no national jurisdiction. You have a breakdown of the rule of law. you have military force concentrated in tribal regimes. And I think it's hard to say that that's an improvement. I think also the effect of the NATO intervention in Libya was to destabilize Mali and other countries. So I think the unintended consequences of the intervention in Libya, like the unintended consequences in Afghanistan and Iraq, were exactly the opposite of what was planned. These wars have not only, I call these wars of decline, the lashing out, as it were, of Western powers faced with situations where they not only make the situation worse in human terms through the catastrophic loss of life, but also the results are often geopolitically the reverse of what was intended. Now, as for Saif Gaddafi, many of you may not know that. He was a former student of mine. I'm glad to, I have no regrets having taught him. I wish he had taken more from what I taught him into practice. When it came to the moment of test, he wobbled, to say the least. And so it's very hard for us to form an objective assessment of all of that from the outside. We don't have adequate information. We do not know exactly what happened. So, in a way, I think history will tell. But on interventions such as Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan, I'm a skeptic. They rarely make the situations better. The cost in human life has been catastrophic in Iraq and elsewhere, and the geopolitical results have often been the worst, have been worse than could have been foreseen. In 2004, the joke in Washington already, in 2005, the joke in Washington already was the war in Iraq is over, Iran has won. The war in Afghanistan, thank you for laughing, already has had catastrophic impact on Pakistan and the destabilization of Pakistan, although that situation might improve. And in Libya, we'll see. But at the moment, the Arab Spring turns out to be a much more complicated process, and we shouldn't really be surprised by that. Take the next question was the way forward from Gridlock, yeah? Way forward after Gridlock? Where's your question? Is that right?
So when we make more successes, it will bring along more problems.
Yes.
So what's your meaning by breaking the gridlock?
Mm. Yeah. Well, breaking gridlock means finding pathways, to turn some of these processes into virtuous circles. So the self-reinforcing interdependence of the post-war period was a virtuous circle. Institutionalization created the conditions for prosperity and development. That was institutionalized and so on. But we've now reached a state where those very conditions of success have created counter-problems, as I suggested, which are handicap resolving essentially pressing global challenges. I think the way forward is to find ways of turning multipolarity, for example, into a virtuous phenomenon. At the moment, the tensions between institutional inertia, for example, the holding on to power of the old Western regimes, and the new emerging voices of many other countries are now in tension with each other. But that's not necessary. It's not necessary if you, of course, deal with the fundamental institutional obstacles that are in your way. And that can only come about by shifting the nature of institutional structures at the global level. Now, I've written extensively on this in the past. I basically think two things. That you couldn't create a modern state just by relying on the rich and powerful to define it themselves. We tend to think of something we call a modern state as having two features. That it has some system of impartial power, so people reach the top of power through some impartial mechanisms, call it democracy or other processes, and that taxation just doesn't depend on the voluntary contributions of the rich, it comes from a universal taxation system. But at the global level, for too long, the dominance of the Western powers has been a parallel to, as it were, in some senses, to a pre-modern state. That is to say, you've had dominant wealthy interests at the top, and you haven't had a system of revenue raising for global issues, because that's been tied to the voluntary contributions, essentially, of the great powers. I think there's two ways to resolve that. You have to resolve it institutionally, and you have to resolve it financially. You resolve it institutionally by creating a different kind of governance, and financially by creating revenues to international institutions that they can use. Now, how you do that, what that looks like, is too complex for me to set out this evening. But in other books of mine, like Global Covenant, or a book I published recently called Cosmopolitanism, that referred to earlier ideals and realities, in those books I've tried to say exactly how you develop these ideas. But it's one thing to develop the ideas, it's another thing to develop the politics to implement these ideas. And that is the problem I've been talking about.
I think we can leave it at that. Thank you so much. The next part of our program.
Just to remind you, if you didn't, some of you may have wanted to ask a question this evening, you didn't get an opportunity to do so. You will get another opportunity on Thursday at 5:30. So see you all there, Knowles 112, on Thursday evening. And finally, could I invite Professor Amy Choi, who is the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, to present a little token of our appreciation to our guest speaker.